And it's apropos our conversation at lunch yesterday, where we discussed this teaching's application to daily life. And I really felt at the time that things were being said that it was a shame that more people hadn't heard. So it's very difficult to kind of reproduce something which arises spontaneously in the moment. But thought it's worth a try.
Well, let's, as you say, not reproduce something with it. So let's start afresh.
Yes, I intend to do that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I think what I will reproduce is my confession that I'm a progressivite. I'm someone who follows a progressive path, and I'm very grateful for what that's brought to me in my life. I'm also very grateful for what your teachings have brought to me in my life, and I haven't seen any conflict within my own practice, my own life, between the two. However, I will say that I find the teachings and the skills and the tools of the progressive path easier to see the relevance of in daily life than it is to see this path and this teaching. I've heard on occasion you're talking about responding to people's questions, like our friend who asked what to do, as examples. But as I mentioned yesterday, it hadn't given me an intuitive sense, an internal intuitive sense of how to respond to life in the field. And I felt the conversation we had was worth exploring, and hopefully something of that can arise from this. Actually, I'm going to jump in with something else. Just to throw it in. Because I have reflected upon it a bit, trying to find my own words, my own understanding. And this is just, groping in the dark and trying to formulate a bit of a framework for myself in terms I can understand. And this is very much a dualistic presentation. I have no aspirations to make it anything more than that. However, it's the interaction for myself as I'm trying to move forward, the interaction between my trust, my deep trust in the transformative power that awareness potentially has upon all levels of my being, in interaction with being responsible in daily life, a willingness to be intuitively alert and sensitive to where behavior and habit are more or less conducive to the presence of awareness, and alternatively, on the other side, more or less conducive to continuing living by habit. So in other words, being more sensitive and alert to when in my daily life it's clear that this kind of action is more conducive to awareness and less conducive to being stuck in the habit of being a separate self, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of paradigm which seems to sum up my attempt to have a personal understanding of how to apply this for myself in daily life. I wonder if you have any comment on that as a starting point.
Well, I think it's a very good place to start. But just before I follow up on your last point, let's just go back to the more general point about the progressive path and the direct path. And I'll just sketch very briefly the main difference in the two approaches. And the that is that the progressive path speaks to a separate self and gives that separate self a series of practices to do. They may be practices that involve the body, our thoughts, feelings. The progressive path gives the separate self a series of practices which gradually refine and purify the separate self until that separate self is considered sufficiently mature or stable to be able to embark on the dissolution of the separate self into the heart of awareness. So these practices might involve, that they might be dietary practices, behavioral practices. They might involve focusing the mind on a mantra, for instance, which would, instead of the mind's normal habit of paying attention to 10,000 things, that the mind is stabilized on one thing, and this brings a measure of stability to the mind before it subsequently then sinks into its essence. So these would be practices that are all aimed at preparing the mind and the body for its eventual subsidence or dissolution in its source. The direct path has a different approach, and that is, in the direct path we go directly to our essential nature, the source of the mind, irrespective of the content of our experience. However we find the mind, the body, our relationships, our activity, we ask the question, what is it that knows or is aware of my tumultuous feelings, my activities, relationships, etc.? What is the continuous element in my experience? What do we mean when we say I? Any of these questions take the mind directly from the objective content of experience to the subject I. And this inward-facing path or process of self-inquiry is engaged irrespective of the content of the mind. However, in this from the point of view of the direct path, it is possible for this recognition of our essential nature to take place under any circumstances and in any condition. However, this recognition of our essential nature is not, in the direct path, considered to be the end of the journey. It is just a step. There is a further step to be taken, which would be to realign the way we think, feel, act, perceive, and relate with this new recognition of ourself. In other words, there is what Francis called a post-enlightenment sadhana, practice or a series of practices that we undertake after the recognition of our true nature to align all our experience with that recognition. And this post-enlightenment sadhana may look or may share many of the characteristics of the pre-enlightenment sadhana that we undertake on the progressive path. On the progressive path, the refining or the purification of or the stabilization of the body and the mind is considered a prerequisite to the recognition of our true nature. In a direct path, this realignment process takes place after the recognition of our true nature. Now, when I say it like this, it's a little linear, either before or after. In practice, it doesn't really happen like that, either on the progressive path or the direct path. On the progressive path, there are these preliminary practices which involve the purification and stabilization of the mind. Then at some point there is this inward-facing path, self-inquiry. There is a recognition of our true nature, and then this purification or realignment process, of course, continues. Likewise, on the direct path, as we explore our true nature, even during the process of investigation or exploration, that exploration is already having an impact on the body and the mind. So the body and the mind is being refined even prior to the recognition of our true nature. It's just that in the direct path, the emphasis is not placed on the purification or stabilization of the mind. The emphasis is put straight away on our true nature. And then only after that recognition, or as we become, at least to a degree, stable in our true nature, then we begin to pay more attention to the colonization of all realms of our experience. So it doesn't really matter which path we take. We shouldn't become direct path fundamentalists. Whole Facebook groups are devoted to debating, often in rather unpleasant and aggressive way, the merits of either the progressive or direct paths. And there is a certain arrogance in these debates. We should take whichever path we feel most comfortable on. That is the direct path for us, whatever it involves. That is the path that we should be on. We shouldn't make a hierarchy of different paths. Whatever path we feel most comfortable on, whatever path resonates with us most deeply, that is the path for us. And there's no need to compare it with another path. Although it is, of course, there is a difference between direct paths, just as there is a direct path and the progressive path, just as there is a difference between numerous progressive paths. And it's legitimate to list or to name those differences.
I'd like to throw in at this point, I find in daily life there are times the mind is more or less clear. Circumstances in daily life. And of course, when it's less clear, those tools of the progressive path are most relevant and work best. And if I try to fake the direct path at those times, it doesn't work for me.
Yes. If the direct path seems to you in those moments to be abstract or intellectual, then engage whatever tools really resonate with you. For another person in a similar situation, the direct path, the investigation into who it is that is having such and such an experience, would be practical, efficient, and then for that person, then that is the path for them.
Right.
But I liked your observation about the sensitivity as to what extent your current feelings or attitudes or behavior reflect the non-dual understanding or the attitude of a separate self. And this is a very good in relation to your question about living this teaching in everyday life. That would be a very good place to start. In relationships, for instance, so much of our life is taken up with a relationship of one sort or another. And in so much of our relationships, there is a degree of conflict. So, for instance, if we find ourselves, whether it's in any kind of relationship, in some form of conflict, rather than trying to change the other in order to bring about a resolution to the conflict, we first asked ourselves, who am I representing? On whose behalf are my thoughts and feelings and my subsequent activities rising in relation to this person? Am I speaking on behalf of the presence of awareness, or am I speaking on behalf of the fears and the desires and the insecurities and the demands of a separate self? And if we find that we are, that our thoughts and feelings are, our subsequent activities are representing the demands and insecurities and fears of a separate self, in that moment, we should investigate the self on whose behalf our thoughts and feelings are being represented, rather than trying to manipulate the other to fall in line with the demands of the separate self. So that would be a very good example in a relationship. And also the way we think about another in a relationship, particularly in a situation where there is conflict. Am I relating to this person with the deep feeling understanding that what they essentially are, irrespective of the content that they bring me, irrespective of the thoughts and feelings that they are expressing in our communication, am I both knowing and feeling that this person is the same essential, unlimited self that I am? Is that my deep feeling in relationship to this person? Or am I relating to them as, am I thinking and feeling of them as an irritating person, or someone who I feel is not speaking the truth, or is not being reasonable, or is not being just, etc.? So again, if we find that we are relating primarily to a person, we're thinking of that, the person with whom we are in conflict, if we are thinking of them just as a person, just as a collection of thoughts and feelings, and trying to manipulate those thoughts and feelings in line with our own demands, we should pause. We should evoke, first of all, what we essentially are, and then feel, not just understand, but feel that the other is that same open, empty, transparent, unlimited presence. And then allow that feeling understanding to condition our subsequent relationship with them. It doesn't mean that we necessarily smile sweetly at them. There may be a difficult situation to discuss with them, but the discussion is informed by our knowledge of that person as ourself. And that will profoundly affect the quality of our relationship. And it is, in fact, in this understanding that all conflicts between people are eventually resolved. So this would be an example of how this understanding has a very practical implication in everyday life.
But it does take a certain willingness to own up to personal realities, particularly in the context of personal relationships, because that's an area, as you rightly pointed out, where it's very easy to get lost in one's own point of view without realizing that's what's happening. So what you offered just now is quite a very clear, thank you for that, a very clear application, which I think is very valuable to explore and work with. I wonder if you could also say something about, say, working with our habits of using free time as a distraction. You know, it can be a whole range of ways that we use our free time. In some ways, they can be very wholesome, like we used the example of gardening the other day. I'm sure that's a very skillful way of applying oneself in nature and But there's so many distractions in this world today, so many temptations to pull us into things. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that particular area of daily life.
There are basically two motivations for undertaking any activity. And the first would be to avoid the discomfort of our present condition. So we feel discomfort. There is a sense of lack. There is something that is missing. We are in some form or another suffering. And the suffering is unpleasant. And we engage in an activity, or there is a desire to engage in an activity for the sole purpose of alleviating the discomfort inherent in that suffering. Now, what that activity is varies from person to person. For one person, it may be a cigarette, a drink, food, drugs. Another person, it may be an activity, a relationship. I don't need to list them. We all know the objects, the substances, the activities, even the subtle states of mind. This is a trap for someone on a spiritual path. The gross objects in which we normally avoid, through which we normally avoid our suffering, are often replaced by the subtle objects that are offered by the spiritual path. Relationships, all the whole array of possibilities from gross to subtle, in which we escape from our suffering into objectivity. That's one possible motive for activity. And the other would be an activity that doesn't come from a sense of lack, and therefore is not trying to alleviate. The activity is not being sought in order to alleviate the sense of lack, but it comes from a sense of fulfillment or peace or understanding. And it is the desire for the activity is motivated by is a desire to express or share that sense of fulfillment. In other words, the purpose of the activity or the relationship in this case is not the relief of suffering. It's not an escape from suffering or an avoidance of suffering. It is an expression or a communication of joy or peace. Now, the same object could be used in both these cases. So, one person, for instance, may feel an absence of love, an absence of fulfillment, may crave relationship, may crave intimate relationship as a means of being fulfilled, as a means of finding love. Another person may feel very loving and very fulfilled and have no need to change their circumstances, but they may desire an intimate relationship simply to share and celebrate the love they feel. So in both cases, these two people desire an intimate relationship, but for very different reasons. The same could be true of an activity such as gardening or reading a book or watching a movie or almost any activity. So what is important really is not so much the activities we engage in, but the deep motive behind those activities. Am I motivated towards this activity, this object, this person, this spiritual method, this, in order to find relief from my suffering? And if the answer is yes, it would be more efficient, instead of going towards the object, however subtle the object, it would be more efficient to turn around and investigate the cause of suffering, which is another way of saying, in direct path language, investigate the self who suffers.
There are many times that can be quite clear and easy to see, but there are other times, like, for example, looking on YouTube for clips of Rupert Spira. YouTube is brilliant at putting suggestions of things you might find interesting. And I feel a lot of distraction can come not so much from a conscious or unconscious wish to fulfill a whole, but something looks interesting or fascinating and you get pulled into it and caught up in it, which happens online quite a bit, I think, for most of us.
Yes, but you're absolutely right. These are very subtle ways in which we avoid the sense of lack. They're just watching another non-dual YouTube clip. It seems to be a very spiritual activity, and therefore it usually remains under the radar of the Advaita police. It doesn't normally. It doesn't usually register as an egoic activity. If we were trying to alleviate our sense of lack through drugs or overuse of alcohol, then obviously immediately that is flagged up. It's obvious what we're doing. But it's much, as you rightly say, it's much less easy to detect these innocuous and even spiritual activities, such as watching too many Rupert Spira YouTube clips, or because these are also activities, subtler activities, but nevertheless activities whose purpose at one point in our life may be to investigate our true nature, and as such they are valid. But there may come a time when it very subtly changes, and they no longer become an expression of our desire for truth, but are simply an activity into which we escape in order to not face our suffering. And in that point, the really spiritual response would be to turn off the YouTube clip, to turn away from the non-dual, so-called, the non-dual spiritual approach, and to turn around and face the suffering from which we are in flight. So that requires, as you said earlier, it requires two things really: a sensitivity to discern in oneself the motive of one's actions, even if one's actions are so-called spiritual, and also a certain courage to follow what this sensitivity, what our intuition tells us. In other words, if we feel that we are watching the spiritual YouTube clip as a means of avoiding having to sit with and face our suffering, then to have the courage to act on that understanding, to pause the YouTube clip, to close your eyes and to face the discomfort rather than simply to avoid it by watching following another Google suggestion, no matter how interesting it is, this column of clips that appears on the right-hand side of our screen. And of course, thinking is the subtlest of all objects, innocuous daydreaming. It's not illegal, it's free, it's not bad for your health, you don't have to be technically savvy. You can, anyone can daydream, and our daydreams, that they are like the innocuous, furry little animal that down the road turns out to be a little monster. Because daydreaming, what could be more innocuous than just a simple daydream? But what the daydreams do, they basically take us away from the here and the now. They take us into a fantasy, and that fantasy is always somewhere other than here and now. In other words, they are the subtlest form of avoidance. So again, this requires sensitivity and courage to feel the suffering. On this path, we become very sensitive to our suffering. We may no longer be suffering terrifically because of some apparently external cause. We may be, but as that layer of suffering diminishes in our life, we become very, very sensitive to suffering, and we detect that even something as innocuous as daydreaming is an escape from a very subtle sense of lack. Now, most people are not in touch. I'm not meaning those of us here, but most people are not in touch with this very subtle sense of lack, because it's a much bigger, more obvious sense of lack that they are being faced with, regular suffering. But even when this normal degree of suffering begins to diminish, or rather as it diminishes, we become more and more sensitive to the very subtle, pervasive, chronic sense of lack that continually motivates us to escape our current situation into some kind of object or activity. And at some point, our so-called spiritual practices can be, they obviously are not always, but they can also be part of this distraction. Our spiritual practices, or just daydreaming. And that requires our sensitivity, and it really, in the end, it comes down to our love of truth. How profoundly, how deeply do we want to get to the root of our suffering? Or are we content that 70% of our suffering has been dissolved as a result of this understanding, and we're happy to continue with this low-grade sense of lack that seems to continually show up on a regular basis in our experience?